Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. Tonight we're going to be discussing a story called Passing by Langston Hughes in the book The Ways of White Folks. We're still in this book, The Ways of White Folks. Now, passing is when a person of a particular race passes himself or herself off as another race. In this story in particular, it is a black man, very fair-skinned black man, passing himself off as a white man. The narrator of the story, his name is Jack, and he's a son who passed his mother on the street one evening and didn't speak to her. So he wrote a letter to her explaining how he felt passing her on the street. And then after he talks about how he felt, he delves into why he's passing as white and the things that are happening in his life as a white man. And I want to read to you the first paragraph of this story as an introduction to things that we will be discussing in this video. Okay, Chapter 4, Passing, Chicago, Sunday, October the 10th. Dear Ma, I felt like a dog passing you downtown last night and not speaking to you. You were great, though. Didn't give a sign that you even knew me, let alone I was your son. If I hadn't had the girl with me, Ma, we might have talked. I'm not as scared as I used to be about somebody taking me for colored anymore, just because I'm seen talking on the street to a Negro. I guess in looks, I'm sort of suspect-proof anyway. You remember what a hard time I used to have in school trying to convince teachers I was really colored? Sometimes, even after they met you, my mother, they wouldn't believe it. They just thought I had a mulatto mammy, I guess. Since I've begun to pass for white, nobody has ever doubted that I am a white man. Where I work, the boss is a Southerner and is always cussing out Negroes in my presence, not dreaming I'm one. It is to laugh. So, Jack explains to his mother that he felt like a dog passing her on the street and not speaking to her because he was passing as white and he was with his girlfriend. And I noticed reading this that he said, if I wasn't with her, we might have talked. You know, we might have. He still doesn't fully feel that he wants to associate with black people out on the street. He said, we may have talked. Now, that is the big subject that comes up when these authors are writing about passing. Now, during the 1930s and after, and even now, people pass for white all the time and pass for different races. What Rachel Dolezal was passing as a black woman, and there's reasons behind that too. But in this particular story and in this particular era, there were many authors who were writing about passing. Langston Hughes didn't write about it extensively, but there are authors like Nella Larson, who wrote the book Quicksand and a book called Passing, and C.W. Chestnut writes Behind the Cedar Doors about passing, and he writes a lot of things about skin color and those, you know, those discussions that we have as black folks about different complexions of skin and things of that nature. C.W. Chestnut writes about that, and he talks about that in a small story called The Wife of His Youth. And he talks about this thing that they had called the Blue Vein Society, where if you were light enough to see that the veins in your skin were blue, you could be a part of their society. So those things, those little separations and stuff in the black race have always been there. They're not discussed. The separation of the race is not discussed extensively in these books because back in the day, white folks weren't trying to distinguish if you were light skinned, brown skinned, Latino, or whatever. If you weren't white like them, then you were discriminated against, and everybody felt it. So, but in this book, Passing, Jack is writing to his mother and said he felt like a dog passing her on the street because if you were passing as white, and if you are passing as white, you have to separate yourself from your family and from the majority of black people who know you because you don't want to be black. Now, as light as I am, I have people in my family who pass as white, and I talked to my dad about people in our family who have passed as white, and as we had this discussion, he said the people who were passing as white, they must be a little bit touched in the head. That was his expression, because if you're passing as white, you have to separate yourself from family and then accept white people who normally would not accept you because of the color of your skin. You're accepting them and hoping that they'll accept you into their society. Now, why would someone want to pass as white? Well, in this story, Jack gives economic reasons. He says during the Depression, while he's passing as white, he's making $65 a day, or if he wasn't passing as white, he would be some bellhopper out of jobs. And he talks about his brother working in the garage and his sister working in cabarets because they're not light enough to pass for white, but he is. So he's passing as white for economic reasons. And also, he has a blonde hair, blue eyed girlfriend, which he plans to marry. And he talks about her in the story. And he said that if he's going to marry her, live white, he doesn't have to worry about the race problem anymore, which many of the authors during this time period, their main subject was racial issues. And in this story, he says he doesn't have to worry about race anymore. And he discusses a topic that a lot of the other authors get into, but is briefly mentioned here, that if he were to have children with this white woman and they came out black, he would deny them. Now, Fannie Hurst is another author who wrote about passing. She wrote a book called The Imitation of Life, which has become a movie. There's a 1933 version, no, a 1934 version, and a 1959 version. The book, Imitation of Life, was written in 1933 by Fannie Hurst. Just a fun fact here, her secretary during that time was Zora Neale Hurston. So all of these writers used to mingle and they all knew each other and they share ideas with each other and come out with these great books. But in Imitation of Life, the book is different than the 1959 version of the movie. In the book Imitation of Life, there's a few things passing. The main character of the story is a white woman who was running a business after her husband passed. Now, her husband and herself shared the same initials, and the business was run by the initials of the husband. So she used his initials to continue to run the business with people who didn't know who she was. So she was a female passing as a man during that time period, because back in the 1930s, many people didn't want to do business with women at that time. And but there was a woman in the book, a black woman who had a child who was passing for white, and she wanted to be white, and she kept moving to different areas and things like that, and her mother kept showing up and ruining the fact that she was a white woman. But in the 1959 version, they had a very emotional ending where the mother died and the woman Piola, I don't know, I can't remember what her name was in the movie, but in the book her name is Piola. She ran back to her mother, and who was dead in the casket and cried and said, I'm sorry, and apologized for, disowning her mother just because she was black. However, in the book, it was different. In the book, Peola left, married a white man, castrated herself in order to not have black children, and they moved off to Bolivia or somewhere in South America like that. She never came back. She separated herself from her mother, passed for white, married a white man, castrated herself so she wouldn't have any black children, and then they went off to do missionary work or something in another country, to escape the racial problems here. And Nella Larson, like I said, she wrote a book called Quicksand and Passing, and we're going to take a look at those stories later on in these videos. So where are they at? They're in Chicago. Jack and his mother, they live in Chicago, and that's where he wrote the letter to, says Chicago on October the 10th. There were many people passing as white in Chicago and in New York, and if you read Langston Hughes' autobiography, he has discussions with other black people about who's passing, and they laugh at it. They look at it as black people putting one over on white folks. If you're going to pass for white, it's hard. The reasons in this story, economic reasons, but you also got to look at what we talked about in other videos as power. The power in the U.S. are white people, so all of the images that you see, all of the privileges that you see, all of the literature that you're taught in school, where all of the protagonists are white and all of the discussions of life have to do about living as white and everything, that influences people to wish that they were white and believe that their life will be easier as white people. So passing is a phenomenon that still goes on today. And the people in my family who pass for white, they separate themselves and we don't ever see them again. And they change their names too. It's weird how, like, for people in my family, the black, we have a name, Maley or male. The black people consider themselves male, M-A-Y-L-E, male, and the ones who pass for white pronounce their names Maley. And when they do cross paths, sometimes arguments ensue, because the white ones, they don't want to be considered black and they don't want to be around black people. But if you're in the same area, you're bound to cross paths. And that has happened a few times in my family. But like my dad said, if you're going to separate yourself from your family and your home just to pass for white, you got to be a little bit touched in the head, as he said. So, the ways of white folks passing, it's a very short story. Let me think of some other issues that I might want to delve into. Yes, Langston Hughes in this story, he's also poking fun at people who pass. In the very first sentence in this story, he says, "Dear Ma, I felt like a dog passing you downtown last night and not speaking to you." He felt like a dog because passing, when you pass, you're denying your race. You're putting down your race. You're saying, I don't want to have anything to do with you guys. I don't want to talk about race. I don't want to associate with you. I'm going to pass for white. And then he goes on in this story. He tries to justify it. He talks about his brother and his sister who can't pass for white, and they're not accepting of him passing as white. And he also talks about living among white people and how they talk bad about black people. He said his boss is a Southerner who cusses Negroes in his presence. He talks about further in the story, he talks about how they just talk about black people and they really don't like black people. And he's around there listening to it, so he's kind of like a spy. You know, he's a black man living around and as white people. And he's writing letters back to his mom about how they discuss black people and how they hate black people and how there is a black person working at his job who is a very, very low level. And Jack says if he were to reveal that he was black, he would get the low level job as well. So the story Passing in the Ways of White Folks, Langston Hughes. The next story that we're going to look at is called The Blues I'm Playing in the Ways of White Folks. And it's a story about music. And in this story, they have the 1920s type of jazz music going on and the 1930s conditions that they're living in, and they have the liberal white folks who want to support black music, but they want to support it the way that they want to. And then in this story, Langston Hughes kind of rights some wrongs that he talks about in his autobiography, but he kind of rights some wrongs that he sees and what happening to blues and music back then in the story. So the next story that we're going to look at is called The Blues I'm Playing. Thank you. This is Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.